If you are like me, you have been looking forward to this talk for quite some time now. It's really my pleasure to bring to our virtual stage Dr. Maria John. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, I would like to let all of you know that the Lehman Center for American History is a collaboration between the Rare Book and Manuscript Library and the Department of History here at Columbia University. It is dedicated to supporting and enhancing the study and teaching of history here at this institution, this fine institution here in New York City. In this past year, my co-director, Hillary Hallett, um, and our associate director, Ty Jones, and the other members of our staff, including Bailey Yellen and Isabel Plowright, all of us decided that it was more critical than ever to engage historical scholarship that offers us tools and perspectives to make sense of the contemporary crises we're facing in this country and in this world. In this context of pandemic, protest movements, toxic cultural conflicts, and white nationalist resurgence, which is not necessarily as resurgent as it was some 2 months and a few days ago, but still certainly present. The question I think facing all of us, certainly here at the Lehman Center, is what does history have to offer? To rise to this challenge, we framed this year's events around themes designed to tackle these questions head on. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Maria John to the Lehman Center today as part of our lecture series on the theme Race, Inequality, and Health. Dr. John is an assistant professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she also serves as director of the Native American and Indigenous Studies program. Her book project, which I think I'm allowed, Maria, a shameless plug for my own department, began as a wonderful dissertation here at Columbia not very long ago. Her book project, titled Sovereign Bodies, Urban Indigenous Health Activism in the United States and Australia, 1950 to 2020, last year. Something tells me that last year might be its own chapter. That project considers the history of indigenous community-controlled health services as key activist-led responses to the settler colonial policies or politics of non-recognition. And in that, she argues that they have served as foundational sites for the realization of non-territorial forms of indigenous sovereignty in the 20th and 21st centuries. Today, Dr. John will present a lecture titled Don't Get Sick After June, a 70-year-long survival strategy for Native Americans navigating the Indian Health Service. In this paper, she argues that the US federal government's woefully inadequate and underfunded system of healthcare for Native peoples is one of the nation's gravest examples of structural inequality and racialized disparity created by the government in the realm of health. Just a little bit more housekeeping. I invite you to join us here, same time, same place, a week from now, when we will host Dan Royals on March 18th to discuss Black gay organizing during the AIDS epidemic. And also later in the month on March 31st, Professor Caleb McDaniel will join us to discuss his Pulitzer Prize winning book, Sweet Taste of Liberty, a true story of slavery and restitution in America. By the way, for videos of past events here at the Lehman Center for American History, and also for registration information for future events, please see our brand new website. I'm really proud of this website, by the way. It is lehmancenter.history.columbia.edu. That is Lehman Center, LEHMANCENTR.history.columbia.edu. Emma, if you can, please put that link on the chat. We would greatly appreciate that. Emma also will be putting some other relevant information, including what I just learned, the History Department's brand new podcast series. So she will put links to that as well. One last piece of housekeeping. The chat room will not be open for general discussion. It is unidirectional this evening because of the number of participants. Welcome to all of you, by the way. We have so many people that we decided to make this as a webinar. And however, please do put your Q&A, pardon me, put your Q&A in the Q&A function. And after Dr. John has completed her talk, we will go straight there and have engagement with those questions. All that said, all that housekeeping having been accomplished, it is my pleasure to welcome to the Lehman Center and her return to the history department here at Columbia University, Dr. Maria John. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you so much, Sam. And thank you to everyone as well for being here today. Sam, that was an incredibly generous introduction, so I really am grateful. And I as well want to thank Bailey and Emma and Nicole and especially Nikita, who are all a part of the incredible support team that makes this seminar and lecture series possible. Thank you as well to all of the graduate workers of Columbia who are continuing a fight that was urgent in my time as a graduate student and which has grown in urgency under the strain of COVID-19. I'm wearing my union badge today in solidarity with the graduate workers of Columbia and in recognition of the fact that the work that they do is essential to the functioning of Columbia. So as Sam's already mentioned, this is sort of something of a return for me. My very first class at Columbia back in 2019 actually took place in the Lehman Center suite, right where I imagine this talk probably would have been happening in non-COVID times. So the sort of full circle moment here is really not lost on me. And this does feel like a homecoming in some ways. So I really, again, want to give a massive shout out to you, Sam, for extending the invitation for me to present my work in this space today. It really does mean a lot. And I'm incredibly excited and grateful to be here. These are incredibly rough times. And, you know, I think all of us are carrying a lot these days. There's a lot of grief. There's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of uncertainty. And so it's also not lost on me that there's a great deal competing for everybody's time and attention these days. So really, thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. Before I dive into my talk and the material I want to share, I do want to begin by acknowledging that as we all quarantine, I sit here today in my home in Boston on the unceded and traditional homelands of the Massachusetts tribe. I want to acknowledge the ongoing presence of this community here, as well as the fact that ongoing histories of settler colonialism and displacement and of Indigenous resistance and survival have meant that new communities of Indigenous people also reside here now, diasporic, urban, and pan-Indigenous alike. Given what I plan to bring into our conversation today, as I draw attention to these Indigenous pasts, presents, and futures, it would be remiss of me if I didn't also share a few quick details about some really vital organizations that are doing on the ground work to support their communities through COVID at the moment. So I'm just going to take a second now to share my screen. Okay, so if I may, I just want to share a quick informational slide here that gives a few quick details about some really vital organizations doing this work on the ground at the moment in the realm of healthcare. So these are details for the Seattle Indian Health Board, the Urban Indian Health Institute, Mother Nation, and Native American Lifelines. All of these are organizations that are doing the sort of work I'm going to be talking about today. I strongly encourage everyone to check out these organizations and how you might support them actively through donations at the moment, which are sorely needed. And because of the work that I do, I want to shine a special light on Mother Nation, which is a nonprofit organization operating out of Seattle. They are the smallest of the organizations amongst the ones that I just mentioned. And since the pandemic began, their crisis caseload has actually tripled. And so they really could do with some support. So I'm just going to leave that slide up there for folks. You can do a screen grab, go to their website, check out how you might be able to support them. But really, wherever you live, I really want to encourage folks to educate yourselves about Native-run health organizations in your local areas, because I guarantee you they are there. Now, the title of my talk today is Don't Get Sick After June, a 70-year-long survival strategy for Native Americans navigating the Indian Health Service. And as advertised, and as Sam mentioned before, what I essentially want to do today is reflect on what two recent crises, the US federal government's record-breaking shutdown in January 2019, and the onslaught of COVID-19 just a year later, might reveal about much deeper histories of settler colonialism and racial discrimination as structuring features of healthcare in the United States. Because I'm a historian of Indigenous health activism, my comments will also seek to remind us what Indigenous communities have done, both historically and in the present, to refuse medical discrimination and to create alternatives for care in the context of neglectful healthcare systems that at best abandon them, at worst actively harm them. And if you caught the piece, I'm sure a lot of you did, in yesterday's New York Times about the recent successes of the Cherokee Nation in their efforts to eradicate COVID-19, I hope my remarks today, particularly about the longer history of Native American health activism, might provide a deeper context for some of what was discussed in that story. So I plan to structure my comments today as follows. I want to begin by telling you all about a very particular piece of Native American health activism that is occurring around COVID at the moment. I'll then pivot quickly to my book project to give you a sense of the longer history of Native American health activism. And then finally, for the majority of the talk, I'll be reflecting on the long histories of underfunding and barriers to access within IHS that have necessitated this activism. All of this is with a view to making the case, as Sam mentioned before, that the US federal government's woefully inadequate and underfunded system of healthcare for Native peoples is one of the nation's gravest examples of structural inequality and racialized disparity created by the government in the realm of health. All the while, please understand that most of my comments today pertain to the history of urban pan-Indigenous activism and health struggles in particular. And in case it's not clear, I also want to point out that I'm being really intentional today about front-loading the activism and the survival pieces of this history, because however badly things may be for urban Indigenous health right now, and I will tell you soon they are bad, it really is because of the activism and the fact that the communities got organized and enacted forms of radical care in the 1970s that a distinctive urban Indigenous healthcare system even exists today. So with that said, let me get right to the present. And I'll begin by introducing a somewhat humorous but also terrible story. So just out of interest, I don't know if there's a way for us to do this since the chat is only open to the panelists, but perhaps the panelists can engage me and just put a yes or a no answer in there for me, because I'm genuinely interested. Out of interest, how many of you caught the recent hashtag something else debacle that kind of unfolded towards the end of last year? And I'd be interested in Q&A time whether folks caught wind of this as well.
Maria, when you said, I'm sorry to interrupt, when you said panelist, do you mean myself as host or?
Yeah, whoever can access the chat basically, so that I can.
The chat is unidirectional, but I guess maybe in the Q&A people could ask more about that. And I will confess now that I have not heard of it. So,
okay, no worries. Yeah. I'm genuinely interested in whether folks have or not. Okay, I'm seeing mostly no's. Okay. Well, for those of you that did miss it, basically, towards the end of last year, back in November, CNN did a segment on the election. And basically, in this segment on the election, they presented exit poll data with the following demographic breakdown. So in this graphic that I've got up on my slide here, they displayed, as you can see, that the electorate was 65% white, 13% Latino, 12% Black, 3% Asian, and 6% something else. Well, Indigenous Twitter basically reacted almost instantly to this, knowing that this nondescript something else likely referred to them. And so hashtag something else fast became a meme. And I have to confess, I needed to exercise a great deal of self-control so that I didn't present 10 slides of memes. But I did want to share just a few to give folks a sense of what this entailed, right? So here are just a few examples. Here are some more. And this is the final slide. So I think this gives you a sense. So while this might just be a sneaky way for me to work some memes into my slides, the underlying point that I really do want to emphasize here is that, this issue, which was really crassly demonstrated in this CNN incident, does reflect a very real, very widespread, long-running problem that Native activists are today referring to as data erasure. Indeed, studies are revealing that one of the biggest ongoing problems of structural violence faced by Native communities in the context of healthcare is a basic but chronic problem of invisibility. Native people are often simply missing from the health data, and COVID-19 is bringing this to light in staggering ways. As of February 2021, data coming out of Baltimore shows 123 American Indian people testing positive for COVID-19, but more than 8,000 cases categorized as unknown or other in terms of ethnicity. In Arizona, almost a fifth of positive COVID-19 cases were unknown race or ethnicity. The Maryland state government doesn't use American Indian as a race category in official COVID-19 data, and it's actually one of 14 states that don't. Recently, Carrie Hawk Lessard of the Boston-Baltimore-based Native American Lifelines organization, which was one of those urban health organizations that I mentioned in my original slide, she's been quoted as saying, "We know who we are, and these are our homelands. So to be rendered invisible is another incidence of historical trauma, but it also conveys that our worth as other, or hashtag something else, is okay." While IHS hospitals on tribal lands often have knowledge and resources to keep more complete racial data, tribes and urban Indian centers are not required to share COVID-19 testing data on the federal level. As Native health activists like Abigail Echohawk, who's the director of the Seattle-based Tribal Epidemiology Center, the Urban Indian Health Institute that I also referenced earlier, as she and others are at pains to explain, this can lead to serious gaps in racial health data and related inequalities in health funding. Echohawk has been a particularly vocal public advocate on these issues. She worries the COVID-19 positivity numbers in urban Indigenous communities in particular do not tell the whole story. In a recent interview, she was quoted as saying, "From the limited data we do have, we are seeing a disproportionate impact. Our community is seeing and having higher rates of COVID-19, but," Echohawk stressed, "we also know this is a gross underreport. If we had the real data, I think that disparity would be much, much higher." Echohawk notes that the best data on Indigenous people is typically collected on the reservations and by Indian Health Service facilities. Non-tribal entities like hospitals, cities, and counties don't always follow the best data collection practices for identifying somebody's race. Data is especially vulnerable for mixed race people, which is the case for many Native people. And I quote Echohawk again, "When you go to a clinic waiting room or your family fills out forms for you, they may not even have the box that says, check this box to identify as American Indian or Alaska Native." Another problem is that we find a lot of people may be uncomfortable asking somebody's race and ethnicity. For American Indian and Alaska Native people, we're one of the highest growing groups of multiracial individuals. So there's no specific look, no specific skin color. We need to be asked these questions, end quote. Echohawk recently spoke before Congress to explain how damaging it is to Native communities to be continually underrepresented in the health data. And the point I think is made really clear in this infographic that I just pulled from the Facebook page of the Urban Indian Health Institute. The text is probably a little too small for you to read it, so I'll just read from it. It says, "The poor health data collection and reporting practices create a data genocide by erasing Native people from COVID-19 numbers, leading to under-resourced programs and inequitable systems," end quote. So I want to place this problem of data genocide and the accompanying Indigenous political project of data sovereignty at the center of my talk today. And, data sovereignty is obviously a response to this problem of data genocide. I want to place this at the center of my talk today because I think it really demonstrates a couple of key things. It demonstrates something really important about Native American health activism, which is that it's framed in terms of sovereignty. But also, because I think this issue of data erasure really drives home a second point, which is the systemic and structural nature of so many of the problems faced by Native people within mainstream and Indian health services. And as I hope it will become apparent later, my research into the much longer history of Native American health activism also underscores that this problem of invisibility in the COVID-19 data is just the latest iteration of forms of exclusion that urban Native communities in particular have faced within the IHS and mainstream health services since at least the middle of the 20th century. The longer history of Native American health activism is the subject of my book project. In summary, I am writing a 20th and 21st century social and political history of urban Indigenous health activism across two settler colonial contexts. My work uncovers how the newly urbanized post-World War II pan-Indigenous communities in both the US and Australia faced parallel struggles against medical mistreatment and neglect, which started in the 1950s in the wake of urbanization. And it follows the story of how this led to a crisis of healthcare access among them by the 1970s. I trace histories of urban Indigenous health activism that began in the 1950s and 60s as everyday refusals and resistances of medical discrimination and neglect. By 1970, the book shows how after almost 20 years of incremental, informal action, urban Aboriginal and Native American health activists succeeded in their respective national contexts in the kind of landmark piece of their activist work, which was the creation of health services by and for their own people. And in both national contexts, they eventually won federal government funding to support their efforts. For those of you who might be more familiar with the US context, this was sort of codified in the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act of 1976, which I'll mention quite a bit in this talk. So the original clinics examined in my book, photographs of which you can see on this slide, were established in 1970 in Seattle and 1971 in Sydney. And they're still serving their communities today, making this an enduring example of a political and social movement that's profoundly shaped urban Indigenous life in these nations. Most particularly, I argue that these pan-Indigenous urban communities blazed a distinctive trail in Indigenous political culture, one that has pushed conversations about sovereignty in new directions, namely in directions that are not only bound up with or tied to land claims and nationhood status. And so I think already in the project of data sovereignty that I mentioned a little earlier, you can kind of see this. The issue at the heart of much of Indigenous history in both the US and Australia, sovereignty, has usually been framed in terms of the maintenance or the recovering of land or nationhood status or waterways. My project, however, considers how new questions about sovereignty emerged from the shifting demography of Indigenous communities since the Second World War. So for example, what did sovereignty mean in this new urban context where you have a really kind of multi and pan-Indigenous community being created, where there isn't necessarily a claim to nationhood status? How under those sorts of conditions might the city space be turned into a pan-Indigenous space? And what kinds of perhaps new forms of sovereignty might arise in these kinds of settings? My book's answers to these questions reveal how sovereignty came to be seen by pan-Indigenous urban communities as portable and as redefined around the idea of identity and self-control of one's own body, which is an interesting insight, I think, that sort of suggests why health has perhaps served as such a crucial site of so much really successful Indigenous activism. So I'm often asked how it was that I came to be interested in these histories, and for the sake of any students who might be participating and in the audience today, I always like to try and explain this because I think this is actually one of the least transparent aspects of what we do, right? How do you figure out a project? The other reason I like to do this is because I think I came about my project in what's typically regarded as a bad way, at least for historians, which is to say that my interests began in the present, not the past. By paying attention to what was going on in the world of Indigenous activism in the present, I started to realize that an incredibly vibrant and successful and active locus of a lot of Indigenous political work is health. So this book project began with the activism and with getting to know the work of these clinics in the present, which naturally led me to a series of questions. Why did communities create these very similar clinics in the US and Australia? And why the 1970s? And what I discovered was a series of reasons, but at one end of the spectrum was just the basic fact that Indigenous people in cities, both in the US and Australia, really struggled to get access to medical care during the 1950s to 70s. And so of course, this led me to ask why. That simple question uncovered a whole series of structural explanations that were common to and traceable to government policy. And so that's what I'm going to be preoccupied with now, namely the flip side of the activism, or rather the long-standing and ongoing histories of medical neglect and structural racism within the healthcare system that has necessitated an equally long, robust, and indeed urgent history of Indigenous health activism. So let me now begin the more historical portion of this paper by once again borrowing from a piece of native humor. So there is a darkly humorous joke that has circulated in many American Indian communities since at least the 1960s, and it goes simply, "Don't get sick after June." And this cartoon here by Oglala Lakota artist Marty Two Balls speaks directly to the unspoken punchline of this joke, because it vividly illustrates how one could easily die waiting for care at the Indian Health Service, where scarce resources are known to run dry in the second half of the calendar year. By unpacking the reasons why, for almost 70 years, the refrain, "Don't get sick after June," has remained painfully relevant for American Indian and Alaska Native communities, I want to draw our attention to the enduring persistence of structural inequalities and racialized disparities that are created and maintained by the government's woefully inadequate system of healthcare for Native people. Moreover, and more broadly, I think the example of Native American healthcare might help us better account for the ways in which contemporary structures of inequality and injustice in health are inextricable from racialized and colonial ideologies of the past. Indeed, in order to fully appreciate the current health disparities facing American Indian and Alaska Native peoples, whether it's in the context of COVID-19 or more broadly, we must first explore the historical roots upon which current structures of inequality have evolved. This is true in a number of ways, of course, but what chiefly preoccupies me is how we can link the structural racism or inequality produced by the government's Indian health policies in the present to an explicitly colonial agenda of the past. Understanding this, I think, underscores the normative import of approaching concepts like structural inequality and structural racism with an attention toward the connections between past and present. And I just want to say here, I think that as we are all hopefully becoming increasingly adept at speaking in terms of structures and of systemic forms of oppression and dispossession and the like, particularly in the wake of events over the course of the last summer, in the wake of George Floyd's murder. I also tend to worry that one danger we might confront in leaning too heavily on notions of structure to account for inequalities in the present is that this diminishes or perhaps simply shifts the attention away from the role of specific agents or intentional projects of the past that account for or which have produced the contemporary structures that we want to critique. Moreover, in the case of Indigenous health, I want to suggest that if we are attuned to the specific and identifiable ways in which present structures of inequality are actually continuous with past attempts at control or domination, the moral significance of combating structural inequalities in the present thereby takes on an even more urgent character, since the injustice is not isolated to the present, but rather is actually continuous with and constitutive of the past colonial project in the present. So with a view to tracing continuity over time, this paper uses the 2019 federal shutdown and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic to distill two especially problematic features of the federal system of healthcare for Native people. And for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to use two helpful visual aids to sort of reference these two issues. So the image here on your left, I've mentioned already, and I use it to represent the first major problem that I think the 2019 shutdown in particular brought to light, which is simply the issue of chronic underfunding. The image you see here on your right is currently the banner graphic on the Seattle Indian Health Board's Facebook page. The Seattle Indian Health Board is one of 42 urban Indian health organizations nationwide that services Native Americans and Alaska Native people who reside in cities across the US. Such clinics provide services ranging from outreach and referral to comprehensive ambulatory care. And as I explain more later, The idea represented in this image that the Seattle Indian Health Board has got you covered, res or no res, speaks to a historical and ongoing problem of healthcare access, medical discrimination, and invisibility that Native people residing in cities have faced since at least the 1960s. And so to be sure, I want to just spell out the arguments that I want to make about each of these two problems. So firstly, the chronic underfunding of the IHS across a period of almost 70 years and in the face of consistent evidence that Native health disparities are exacerbated, if not in part caused by inadequate government healthcare services, demands that we treat this as an abrogation of the federal government's trust responsibility to Native peoples. But also, to the extent that these poor health services are indeed a cause of American Indian and Alaska Native poor health, perhaps the more salient point is that we must go further and treat this as a government-created racial disparity in health outcomes and in healthcare. The second issue, the troubled history of urban Indian access to IHS services in particular, demonstrates the government's racialized criteria for determining who has the right to access IHS medical care. Over 70% of American Indians and Alaska Natives live in urban areas, but funding for those patients is less than 1% of the IHS budget. This gross inequality in the government's allocation of resources is a legacy of historical and ongoing policies, such as blood quantum or federal recognition, that A, have sought to racialize American Indian populations as opposed to recognizing their sovereignty, and that B, have effectively enshrined a spatial logics of colonial governance in health policy, whereby indigeneity is confined to specific locales, i.e. the res. In other words, the denial of health services to urban Indigenous peoples as a matter of outright policy or as a byproduct of underfunding or undercounting, tells us about the project of settler colonialism in the United States. It is clear that health policies and the medical system were and still are part and parcel of the colonial attempt to control Indigenous people by circulating the ways and the places in which they can claim their identities and rights as Indigenous peoples. In keeping with its policy goals of assimilating Native peoples, the US government has long defined indigeneity in spatial terms, seeking to differentiate Indigenous peoples' identities as American or Indian on the basis of where they lived. This technique of colonial control and denial of services to Indigenous peoples in urban areas should be recognized as a manifestation of settler colonialism and public health's spatial and racialized forms of governance. And so with that said, let me just stress again that I argue these issues are urgent, not simply because the costs in the present for Indigenous communities are high, but because these inequalities are the continuance of colonial structures into the present. So by failing to address these inequalities, we therefore don't simply fail to solve a pressing problem in the present, we also fail to take a stand against injustices of the past and to put an end to colonialism in the present. So to advance this line of thinking, the first argument I really want to make is that in most mainstream discussions about COVID-19 and Native communities, I think we lack a sufficient reckoning with, or even an acknowledgement that for Native people, this health crisis is actually a matter of their sovereignty. And what I mean by that becomes obvious if we consider the basic historical and legal origins of the federal government's responsibility for Native American healthcare. In the briefest of terms, treaties are the original legal foundation for the federal government's obligation to provide healthcare for Native people. So if we look at treaty history, we see, for example, that many tribes specifically negotiated for healthcare from the federal government. With the passage of time, an extensive history of laws and judicial decisions collectively form the modern legal basis of this obligation. The most recent articulation of this is the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act of 1976, while the primary authorization to pay for federal services remains the Snyder Act of 1921. This body of laws forms the government's trust responsibility towards Native peoples, and this kind of articulates how that applies to healthcare. The problem is, the federal government has never lived up to its promises of providing resources sufficient for the health and well-being of Native people. A near 70-year history of chronic IHS underfunding is evidence of this. And because I don't really have the time to go into this history, I'm going to do this really kind of terrible thing of pointing you to an article that I recently had published. But this article that I had come out in the spring 2020 issue of the Native Studies Journal is really an attempt to kind of lay out this 70-year-long history of underfunding in some detail. And in this article, I'm really trying to push an argument that this underfunding constitutes a really serious form of abandonment, and that abandonment in turn should be recognized as a form of violence. So if you're interested in those issues in particular, I just kind of point you to this publication. So this history of underfunding is sort of one piece of evidence of the federal government's failure to live up to its trust responsibilities. But the vast health disparities that exist today between Native peoples and other populations are also evidence of the government's failure to live up to its trust responsibilities. And, you know, we might think about the existence of these health disparities specifically in the context of COVID-19 if we wish. As all of you, I'm sure, are aware, there are all sorts of statistics that we can kind of look to sort of trace and track the disproportionate impact of COVID on Native peoples and communities. We can look at the data from several different entry points, but we don't even have to kind of limit ourselves to thinking about this in the context of COVID, of course. There are so many other metrics by which we can look at the disproportionately bad health outcomes for Native communities. And I'm just going to quickly flick through a few slides here that sort of point to some especially problematic health areas. Diabetes is a really big one for Native communities, and infant and child health is also a really significant marker of disparity. In December 2018, Chief Executive of the National Indian Health Board, Stacey Boland of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians stated, and I quote, "Native Americans and Alaska Natives have the highest rates of diabetes, are 5 times more likely than non-Hispanic whites to have tuberculosis, and Native youth are more likely to commit suicide than any other group." In short, she summarized, and I quote again, "We are sicker, die younger, and suffer longer than any group in the United States. And why? Because of broken promises. It is long past due to invest in the health of Indian country." End quote. Boland was actually responding there to a damning 2018 report from the US Commission on Civil Rights, which found that federal funding for Native American programs across the government remains grossly inadequate to meet the most basic needs the federal government is obligated to provide. And moreover, in some respects, i.e. health, they found that the US government has actually backslid in its treatment of Native Americans. The life expectancy for Native peoples is 5.5 years less than the national average. Native Americans die at higher rates than those of other Americans from chronic liver disease, diabetes, unintentional injuries, assaults and homicides, intentional self-harm and suicide, and chronic lower respiratory diseases. According to one study, Native American women are 4.5 times more likely than non-Hispanic white women to die while pregnant. The CDC found between 2005 and 2014 that every racial group experienced a decline in infant mortality except Native people. Instances of depression, substance abuse, and suicide are all too common amongst Native youth. And as I'll discuss more, these health conditions are worst in urban communities and compounded by poor access to quality healthcare that has been promised as a matter of treaty rights. So the point that I really want to underscore here is that when we look at the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Native communities and all the underlying health issues that this brings to light, and when we're also aware of the federal government's obligations to provide for Native health and healthcare, we come to see how a lot of mainstream discourse around COVID-19 and Native communities misconstrues or at best fails to fully understand or represent the full extent of the injustice or the crisis that this pandemic represents for Native peoples. Rarely do we see the injustices brought on by or reflected in the disproportionate impact of the pandemic framed as a matter of Indigenous sovereignty. But it matters that we understand it this way because seeing COVID-19 as an issue of Native sovereignty helps us fit this latest health crisis into a much longer, indeed systemic pattern of neglect, abrogation of federal responsibility. And as I've hinted at already, seeing it as a matter of sovereignty also puts it in the context of a long history of Indigenous survival and radical care in the face of persistent neglect. So the second major argument, which is closely related, that I want to make here is that for Native communities, COVID-19 is not actually a crisis. And I think we must stop referring to it in that way. We encounter this language of crisis so much around Native health issues, not just in the context of COVID-19, but more broadly, and for what I'd argue is actually a period of some 70, 80, or 90 years. As far back as 1928, a famous government report known commonly as the Merriam Report decried the state of Indian health and healthcare at the time, and almost every year since, medical and government reporting alike has seemingly for the first time over and over again highlighted the urgency of Native American health disparities as a crisis. And I've actually started kind of collecting these news headlines. A lot of the ones that I'm going to be sharing with you today are from the kind of 2015-16 period, but these stretch backwards and forwards from this time frame. And I'm just going to give you examples of a few here, just so that you kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about. So reports yield recommendations, yet nothing of substance changes. And as I've argued in the recent article that I just referred to before, I don't think we can keep calling something a crisis for a period of some 70, 80, or 90 years and still use that term with any integrity. Crisis, I think, suggests a moment of aberration, of deviation from the usual or traditional mode of operation. But when it comes to Native health, history tells a very different story indeed. The way COVID-19 is playing out in Native communities is not an aberration at all. And we don't even have to go back that far in history to see this. Just think of what happened as recently as the 2019 government shutdown. Admittedly, I know a lot has happened since then, but I think we can all stretch our minds back and we can probably all still remember this shutdown, right? Which occurred from, I think it was midnight on December 22nd, 2018 until January 25th, 2019. So 35 days altogether. At the time, it was the longest US government shutdown in history. And amidst the many disturbing and urgent headlines that were vying for the attention and sympathies of the nation at the time, a series of news stories about Native people started to emerge in early January. And I have here on this slide just some of those headlines. Meanwhile, on January 10th, intertribal leaders and organizations, including the National Council on Urban Indian Health, the National Indian Health Board, and the National Congress of American Indians, released a public statement calling on the former administration to bring an immediate end to the shutdown. Among other costs being incurred by Native peoples, these spokespeople were at pains to explain, and I quote, "Our communities rely on federal funding to administer key tribal government services, healthcare facilities, public safety, housing access, nutrition, and food distribution programs, as well as social services. The shutdown is destabilizing these programs and causing fear and anxiety amongst our members." The impacts in terms of health were especially alarming. One news story explained, and I quote, "Tribal governments are cutting other services and scraping together scarce dollars or securing interest-bearing loans to keep health clinics operational, but this is not sustainable." The authors of the January 10th letter also reported that in the urban context, clinics were already starting to close their doors, and I quote, "2 of the facilities will shut down in the next week, while 5 face closure within 30 days if the shutdown continues." Across reservations and urban contexts, the authors of the letters was clear. Our citizens are worried about whether they will be able to receive healthcare. At the time, Carrie Hawk Lessard of the Native American Lifelines organization explained in an NPR interview precisely how the shutdown was exacerbating an already fragile system of care. And I quote, "As a contract site with IHS, we operate on a cost reimbursement basis, which means we spend money and send vouchers into the IHS and then we get paid back. Before the shutdown, IHS owed us 2 months worth of vouchers. So when the shutdown occurred, any payments to us stopped, which means we had to make some quick decisions about what we were going to do. Our board, in concert with our fiscal people, decided that we would have money to operate just to the end of this week." The question of injustice was also not far from Lessard's mind. And I quote, "It's really difficult for a lot of reasons, but I think primarily because all the services to Indian people are predicated on treaty rights and trust responsibilities. We paid well in advance in our lands and with our bodies. One of my ancestors is a survivor of boarding schools. So the fact these things aren't available to us now because the government can't get along is just mind-boggling to me." End quote. In drawing our attention to the particular vulnerabilities of Native populations in the wake of these two recent disasters, the point I want to underscore is that perhaps more than anything, what the shutdown and COVID-19 have revealed is how thin the IHS is stretched in normal times. To better understand why the shortfall in services and funding in urban areas is an especially egregious issue, one that Native health advocates like Echo Hawk and Hawk Lessard are particularly concerned to champion in the context of COVID-19, we must comprehend the numbers and the history a little more closely. So as I intimated really early on, over 70%, it's actually closer to 76% of Native peoples live in urban areas today. Data shows that many of the recurring health problems faced by Native people in general are more acute for those living in urban areas. According to IHS, Native youth residing in cities are at greater risk for serious mental health and substance abuse problems, suicide, and teen pregnancy. These persistent health issues are often compounded by urban Indians' inadequate access to healthcare services. The Kaiser Family Foundation has found the share of IHS funding going to urban programs over time has not reflected the overall demographic shift of American Indians away from reservations. On average, only 1% of the IHS budget has been allocated to urban Indian healthcare. The insufficiency of this 1% budget has been repeatedly underscored by Native advocates. As Dr. Bonnie Duran explained in the American Journal of Public Health back in 2005, at that time, more than 60% of members of US tribes reside outside their reservations at least part of the year, but only 1% of the IHS budget is earmarked for urban Indian healthcare. So not only is federal funding of urban Indian healthcare inadequate to cover the needs of this population, but due to the ways in which services are restricted through compacting agreements and geographic restrictions, in the case of urban communities, these services often simply aren't available. Urban Indian clinics constantly find themselves on the defensive for complex reasons, but the simple fact is budget cuts are a persistent threat. In February 2006, for instance, the George W. Bush administration proposed eliminating the Urban Indian Health Program established as Title V of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, arguing that urban Indian health organization clients could instead use federally supported community health centers that serve the general public. The assimilationist logic at work in this kind of statement and the plain disregard for the fact that these healthcare provisions are owed to Native peoples as a matter of treaty rights and trust responsibilities are deeply embedded in these frequent proposals by the federal government. Indeed, the suggestion that urban Indians could simply make use of mainstream healthcare like any other American harkens back to the very reason it was so hard for urban Indians to get a piece of the federal government's health budget in the first place. In keeping with the policy goals of the termination era in federal Indian policy that began in the 1950s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the IHS initially developed a policy for Indian healthcare that effectively meant once you left the reservation, you were no longer Indian. Personal testimonies, such as the following one from a Seattle Indian resident in 1968, describe how these barriers to access imposed on urban Indians by the government could lead to patently inconsistent outcomes. And I quote, "The system makes it possible for one brother living at home on the reservation to get BIA support, while another living with relatives in a nearby city to get no BIA support." End quote. Other stories I found in the archives spoke to an uglier side of this history, as countless urban Indians across the US were turned away from medical mainstream care throughout the 1950s and 70s by providers who assumed all Indians were entitled to government healthcare and justified denying services to Indian patients on this basis. At the National Council of Indian Opportunity's 1969 public forum in Dallas, Texas, these issues came up frequently. For example, in addressing LaDonna Harris, who was the presiding chair of the meeting, one Mrs. Edwards described how upon arrival at their local hospital, her family was greeted with the following response almost immediately, and I quote, "Why don't you go ask the BIA?" "Everywhere I go," she exclaimed, "this is what comes up." Clearly exasperated, she implored Harris, I would like for it to be advertised that the BIA doesn't help all Indians." In response, Harris offered this woman much sympathy. She said, "This is a great misunderstanding nationally. If you are an Indian, people think you can receive all services from the BIA. And as you say, this is not true. This is a very hard thing to get across to non-Indians sometimes, and particularly to institutions that ought to know better." End quote. As I discuss at length in my book project, these common experiences of exclusion and discrimination, on top of more explicitly hostile and racist denials of treatment to Native peoples by mainstream health facilities in the 1950s to 60s, led to a full-blown healthcare crisis in many American cities by the 1970s, as most urban Indians found themselves without access to any healthcare at all. In the face of such experiences, it is undeniable that such barriers and eligibility requirements imposed on urban Indians have been productive of legalities that encouraged and created a great deal of racism within the structures of medicine, healthcare, and public health. However, my point in this paper is also that these structural impediments preventing urban Indians from accessing government healthcare, which they are owed as a matter of treaty rights, are not simply productive of structural racism within health systems and health outcomes, but they are also, in fact, based on and thus continuous of past governmental policies that were explicitly expressive of a racializing and assimilative agenda. Indeed, it's hard to ignore how such policies effectively worked and still do to enshrine a spatial logics of colonial governance in health policy, since this worked to confine indigeneity to specific locales, i.e. the reservation. While termination era policies have received much attention from historians, it is rarely mentioned that one of the first significant areas in which the federal government sought to end its special responsibilities for Native peoples came when President Eisenhower signed Public Law 83-586 into existence in 1955. With this public policy, also known as the Indian Health Transfer Act, Eisenhower effectively turned healthcare into the US government's first definitive step in completely liquidating the Indian service and in meeting the overall post-World War II Indian policy objectives of terminating all federal responsibility for Native peoples. This came as part of a much wider suite of post-war programs that actively encouraged and financed assimilation via the relocation of scores of Native people from rural into urban areas, and which divided their rights to services like healthcare accordingly. Such measures sought to cement a process whereby Indigenous people were treated as individuals with Native rights only on reservations and as part of mainstream society in urban areas. This was indeed the policy of the Indian Health Care until Title V of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act changed history and allocated a portion of IHS funds specifically for urban communities in 1976. However, as repeated testimonies of healthcare professionals, Native organizations, community members, and leaders attest, while the existence of Title V has been hugely significant, the failure of federal funding allocations for urban communities to catch up with and meet the needs of the vastly expanding urban population is a serious problem. The reluctance of the government to change its funding structures to allocate a larger portion to urban Indians or to bring the funding of IHS as a whole up to the level that would meet the needs of Native communities, both reservation and urban, and indeed the active attempts by successive administrations to actually scale back the funding for urban Indian health must be recognized for how this continues an assimilationist policy agenda and is thus continuous with an original reluctance to fund urban Indian programs at all. During the 1970s, urban Indian health activists explained how difficult it was to convince the government that they were, in effect, still Indian after they left the reservation. In 2021, urban Indian health activists exposed the erasure of non-reservation health data from mainstream hospital records because Indigenous patients have no way of making their ethnicity legible to the system as anything other than #something else. The notion that somehow Native people's health needs, or for that matter, their rights and entitlements to government-provided healthcare only hold on reservations has been a running theme in the advocacy work of urban Indian health activists since the 1950s. The current cover image on the Seattle Indian Health Board's Facebook page encapsulates the message and the continued injustice facing many urban Indians when it comes to accessing healthcare. What is striking to me is if we think about the advocacy work of Native health activists around COVID-19, we see the persistence of this theme of invisibility. The current work of Native health activists like Abigail Echo Hawk and others working on the problem of data erasure and data genocide in the 21st century really underscores the ongoing systemic nature of the exclusion and invisibility that so many Native peoples must continually confront in the healthcare system, whether it's in the context of the IHS specifically or within mainstream healthcare systems in the context of a global pandemic. These continuing realities of funding shortfalls and a system of care that is unable to see, recognize, or record, let alone act on, the urgency of medical neglect and need in urban Indian communities shows how structural inequalities are on the one hand produced by these persistently inadequate federal health services, but also, on the other hand, how in the case of urban Indian healthcare in particular, colonial agendas of the past are also maintained by a system that in effect through underfunding or undercounting, denies federal Indian health services to urban Indians in the present. When we understand the historically persistent nature of these funding shortfalls, and in the case of urban Indians, the assimilative agenda and reasons for the original and ongoing barriers to accessing government-provided healthcare placed on their communities, it seems the case of Native American healthcare must be recognized for what it is: the persistence of colonial, racialized, and spatial modes of governance through health policy. And so I'm just going to take a couple minutes to wrap up here. And I want to do so by sort of posing a final question for us, one that I hope folks in the audience may be able to help me think through. Because as I outlined earlier, my book project is preoccupied with this landmark moment in American Indian politics that's little known or understood outside of the communities in which it happened. Namely this incredible story of how Native American health activists, a lot of whom were women, succeeded in securing a form of community-run healthcare for their people that has since blossomed into a nationwide system of urban Indian health clinics that service Native people right across the country to this day. And as I've already explained, this form of community care really emerged from another healthcare crisis in the 1970s, a crisis of healthcare access among Native people due to widespread discrimination and ultimately exclusion of urban Native people within mainstream healthcare settings. To combat this, urban Indian health activists and organizers essentially created their own form of community-controlled healthcare, and they eventually won funding through the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. And again, these clinics are the basis of most urban Indian healthcare to this day. And in my work, I show how this momentous achievement of the 1970s really began with forms of community care and mutual aid. Now, arguably, we are seeing comparable forms of community initiative and radical care emerging in the context of COVID-19, not just amongst Native communities, but much more widely, right? But I guess one question that I have for us in closing today, and I've really been trying to think through this recently, and it relates to a concern that I do borrow directly from scholars Hi'ile Hobart and Tamara Nees. In a special 2020 issue of Social Text on the theme of radical care, they write, and I quote, "We define radical care as a set of vital but underappreciated strategies for enduring precarious worlds. While radical care is often connected to positive political change by providing spaces of hope in dark times, we simultaneously acknowledge the negative effects associated with care. Because radical care is inseparable from systemic inequality and power structures, it can be used to coerce subjects into new forms of surveillance and unpaid labor, to make up for institutional neglect, and even to position some groups against others, determining who is worthy of care and who is not. Even so, in the face of state-sanctioned violence, economic crisis, impending ecological collapse, collective care offers a way forward," end quote. And so my question for us in closing is really to think about how we might be able to nurture movements of collective care that are not born of crisis. And what's more, how might we ensure that they're not rendered invisible by history? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Were we all gathered together in person at the newly renovated Lehman Suite, this would be where the deafening applause would certainly be greeting you. Thank you so much. This is fantastic work. There's so much to discuss here, so much. This is, and to begin that, I'd like to remind our audience, you may place your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please feel free to do that. I also wanted to a little bit more housekeeping. I neglected to thank Emma Scheinbaum, for whom we have to, or to whom we should thank for organizing all of this. Emma, I apologize, I did not mention you at the top of my comments, and certainly would not have gone the rest of this evening without having done so. So thank you so much, Emma, for all of your work. Something else as well, I want to take this opportunity, which I should have done at the beginning, to also acknowledge that Columbia University, both of its campuses, both of its Manhattan campuses, sit on Lenape land. And we at the Lehman Center of American History certainly want to acknowledge that history, and that this, as old as this institution is, it sits on land that well before its founding was a traditional and ancestral unceded territory of the Lenape people. And this is a land on which we learn, gather, and produce our work. And we certainly acknowledge that we are the Lehman Center for American History, and certainly understanding American history is acknowledging that and pursuing an agenda of understanding that history in all of its facets. So thank you so much, Maria. I want to take the moderator's prerogative, shall we say, and open up with a few questions. Well, I'll start with one. I have lots of questions written down, but I will also open the discussion up, or at least open the questions up to those who have posed them in the Q&A function. I mean, wow, there is so much here. You opened up with this the concept of data invisibility and data genocide, which that alone just stuck in my head for so long that I had to make sure that I kept up with the rest of the talk. And it was a really powerful way on which to begin. And you linked it. Well, first of all, there's the I was about to say crisis, but you made it very clear. This is not a crisis that we saw last year or that we're seeing today. This is status quo. Um, you link that with COVID-19 and data invisibility, that we just don't count native peoples the same way or in ways that would be appropriate, largely because the assumption this is a certain kind of territoriality of race. If you're not on the res, you don't get counted as being a native person. It strikes me that there is this within this story, or at least maybe adjacent to this story, is this other history of epidemiology and just how epidemiology counts people, right? There was so many, what you were saying about like the pre-existing conditions for in native communities that clearly had an impact on the morbidity and mortality of COVID-19 um, amongst those populations. Looked a lot like what we saw back in April, the kind of shock and awe about higher death rates among Black Americans. There used to be a time when epidemiology, part of its task was not just to think about the recent past of how do we get certain conditions, but also to develop epidemiological predictive models. And that clearly was not the case there. So I guess that's a long prologue to a question of, is there a story in yours of social medicine and social epidemiology and perhaps its failures? I don't know if that's too strong a word, but at the moment it doesn't strike me as such. That those who would have argued perhaps in the 1960s and 70s for a social epidemiology that looks at what today we put in brand new wine bottles as structural health inequities, what we used to call racial health disparities even before that. But that genealogy goes back to the period in which you start your work. So I guess I have a question of, is there, and I don't want to put you in a place of advocating for a declension narrative, but at least where I've thought about this history, not the history of Native people in health, that is not my lane, but in your lane is adjacent to mine. There are ways in which things that we knew as far back as 75 years ago, maybe even 100 years ago, we don't know now. Is that part of your story?
Thanks, Sam. It's such a thoughtful question, and it's such an important one, and certainly one that I want to think about more. But I think what's really striking to me, and again, I kind of come at this through sort of tracing the history of the activism, right? Because it's the other side of that coin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even in terms of, and this is one of the connections that I'm trying to draw, that's new, since the material you would have read for the dissertation project, Sam. I'm actually trying to trace a connection between the work that's going on around this data sovereignty piece and the data genocide argument, and forms of kind of knowledge creation and building that were going on in earnest in the 1950s and 60s. Like one of the very first pieces of really critical activism amongst the community that was forming in Seattle around that sort of moment in the 1950s really revolved around simply making themselves visible and legible, right? For the very same sorts of purposes that activists like Abigail Echo Hawke and Carrie Hawk Blezard are sort of advocating for now, right? Because the argument was being made at the time, and this was sort of in the service of trying to appeal to the government for funding, was that, unless we can speak solidly in terms of our numbers, we're not going to be able to make a really compelling argument for the sorts of supports that they were looking for. And so one really, really early piece of activism, and I think this also kind of illustrates the ways in which I'm trying to think a little bit more expansively about what we think about when we say that word activism, right? Because I think particularly in the context of Native American politics, when people think of activism in that period of the 60s and 70s, our minds automatically kind of go to Red Power, AIM. But what I'm trying to bring to the surface is these different forms of what I'm calling kind of quieter forms of activism, which may not be all that apparent or recognizable at first. And one such example really relates to this issue that you're bringing up around, forms of knowledge, because members of the community at the time in the 1950s and 60s did things like simply go around knocking on doors to try and, in the language of the time, find the Indians, was how they described what they were doing, right? And even just that simple piece of information collecting and, gathering the numbers of where and how many of their community members were in the city was actually a really vital piece of organizing and activism that built into other forms of knowledge creation around specific health issues that came later when the health activism sort of took shape. So I think there's this incredible line of continuity that I see between the work that was going on, as I said, sort of particularly amongst women in the community, and what I'm seeing happening now around COVID, around this data genocide and data sovereignty piece too. So I'm really drawn to thinking about those connections and thinking about a sort of through line that can be drawn there, because I think it comes out really apparently in the activism and just underscores how pervasive and long-lasting this issue of invisibility really is, and how central it is to so many of the other problems that Native peoples face within a healthcare context.
Yeah, there's so much there as well that, I mean, we've kept you here for one talk, but we could bring you back every week for the next few months to have a different topic. There's so much there. In your response to that, it occurred to me that I think the word used was continuity, but I mean, there might be ways in which there's also a certain causality as well, that quite often when health sciences, its researchers, its teachers, its practitioners, when they make these paradigmatic changes in their study and in their practice, it's because of the activism of non-medical people, right? I mean, that's how you get, I mean, in so many ways, like the medical, again, in my lane, the medical civil rights movement. You look at HIV, AIDS, right? There were so many people who went into that work, but who began as just activists, lay people activists, and then now, who are in their mid to late careers as researchers and practitioners as a result of that activism, or people who owe their practice to activists who came before them. I want to go to, because like I said, I could just go on with my list of questions, which would be very selfish as the host, but I want to go to, there was a question that came up from Emily Hashem. Thank you, Emily, for joining us. She asks, or they ask, can you discuss the interaction of indigenous people in the US with other public health services, parenthetically, that aren't dedicated to indigenous people, end parentheses, and how that relates to the arguments you made in your presentation, the overall health disparities affecting Native communities?
It's a really fantastic question, Emily. Thank you so much for asking it. Wow, there are so many directions in which I could take this question. I mean, I'll start off by saying that, I think one of the things I should probably make clear is that, a lot of the experiences of discrimination and exclusion that I referred to throughout my talk were taking place in sort of contexts of mainstream health, right? And so, all those histories that I chart, I mean, may be examples or instances of, things like, what you might be looking for. But in terms of the specifically kind of public health element of it, I mean, your question actually makes me think of, what's sort of happening now as a really interesting example of, I think, why we might look to the example of Native American health activism as a particularly kind of successful piece of advocacy for Native sovereignty, right? And if I may, I'm just going to sort of share my slides again, because I think my point can best be made by sort of sharing a little bit of what the communities are doing at the moment, actually around COVID, and what their sort of public health measures and interventions look like. And, again, I'll just kind of raise awareness for the piece that came out in the New York Times just yesterday. It was in the opinion section, and it was a piece that kind of reflected mostly on the success of the Cherokee Nation in their attempts to eradicate COVID. And so, that was more a commentary on the sort of success of the Cherokee Nation's public health response. But I think that can be extrapolated out, we can extrapolate out from that to make a broader point that I hope will kind of speak to some of your question, Emily. So I'm just going to flash forward to a couple of slides that show you some of the response in Native communities around vaccination. So there's this really incredible poster series that I am really fond of sort of drawing people's attention to, because I think it really underscores the significance of what a lot of the Native health activism has resulted in and produced within the context of Native healthcare that has been incredibly successful. And it's actually given rise to a whole language now in public health discourse that's called culturally competent care, right? And so these posters that I'm going to show you in a second, I think are a really sort of vibrant example of what precisely that means. And we know that vaccination compliance and interest in Native communities has been really quite high, actually. And so I think these posters are very suggestive of some of the reasons why that might be the case, right? So as you can see, there are sort of points of emphasis within these posters that really kind of draw from a sort of cultural framework, right? So this notion of protecting future generations, sort of centering the significance of Native people as healthcare workers, and the kind of emphasis of community being at the center of that. And then this one I think is especially interesting because it deploys this language of being a good ancestor, which really sort of taps into a cultural framework for how Native communities have long approached the importance and significance of health as a part of their sovereignty. So, Emily, I think, when it comes to how we can look at the sort of public health resourcing around COVID, I think this is a really interesting way that we can see how the sort of success of Native health activism and its, the centrality of its being tied to concepts of sovereignty really does kind of, I think, account for how it is that Native communities have been successful, on the sort of public health end of trying to respond to COVID. So again, I frankly try and take any excuse to try and share these resources because I think they're incredibly evocative. So Emily, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to do that. I hope that's answered your question.
Was there a site, by the way, that you might be able to give off,
Yeah,
from rote
absolutely.
memory that
Absolutely.
our audience might check? Or
Yeah,
maybe if Emma is able to put it in the chat for us, that would be
definitely.
fantastic.
I'll
Yeah.
just flash quickly back to that particular slide so that you can kind of screen grab. So this is actually from the Urban Indian Health Institute. And I just encourage folks to go there and just kind of check out what they're doing. So this is the Tribal Epidemiology Center that I kind of referenced at the beginning. And they have a ton of resources on there that are incredibly rich. So yeah, I just encourage folks to go and check it out. So, and I'm not sure if you've been able to kind of grab the website, but I'd be happy to share this sort of after the talk as well.
Yeah, and I think just for our audience, the salient part is uihi.org, and then you could navigate from there. I had a moment to take a look at their Twitter feed and the site. It has quite a bit of rich information there, so I highly recommend that. I mean, from my brief exposure during your talk, Brian Kettering, I'm sorry, Kettenring, sorry about that, Brian, wants to ask you: does your framing of indigenous health does your framing of indigenous health as a matter of sovereignty point to any possible strategies in the present about using a comparatively sympathetic, parentheses, or less hostile federal administration as a negotiating target slash partner? And Brian says also in parentheses, this very well may be happening.
Thank
What are your I
Yeah.
think this is your opportunity. Maybe I should have saved this question for last. This is your opportunity to give an opinion about our new Biden-Harris administration and its
Absolutely.
health service.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Brian. It's a really thoughtful one. You know, I like to think that there are going to be opportunities. You know, I think we're still in the early days of this administration, but there's certainly been a lot that's been promised, right? So I'm all for being hopeful. I think, as has been the case before, though, we've had previous moments of hope as well. I really think if we pay attention to what the activists are focused on and what the kind of consistent ask is from advocates of Native health, we really can't get past this issue of funding. It's, you know, in the case of what I drew our attention to in terms of the shutdown, you know, I think that issue in particular raised the significance of the issue of advanced appropriations, right? Because Native health units do not have that at present, which is incredibly problematic. And so an incredibly important piece of the advocacy work and the organizing that's been ongoing for a very long time is pushing not simply for a bigger and better budget, but pushing for a kind of restructuring of how that funding is distributed and dispersed, right? So I think until we can get to a point where that funding question really is addressed in a meaningful way, and again, addressing that requires a whole series of other pieces of the puzzle to shift, right? Because as I've been at pains to sort of lay out in the talk, so much of the blockage has to do with how the federal government does or rather does not recognize indigeneity. And until we can kind of move past that issue, it's hard to see how the argument for greater funding for urban communities is really going to shift in a meaningful way. The other problem that is really inextricably tied to all of this is the fact that, and this is another sort of, I guess, structural, like problematic structural element of the funding issue, is that, you know, whilst it's a single pot like this, anything that's taken or any increase that's sort of seen to be going towards the urban communities is going to be taking away from the reservation communities, right? And so because of that, it's actually a really kind of unfortunate byproduct of how this sort of funding has been structured over the years. But you know, it is a source of tension between reservation and urban communities because there is this single pot, right? So it's seemingly, I mean, when you raise the question of funding, it sort of seems like, you know, the answer would be just to throw more money at the problem, but it it sort of isn't as simple as that, even though that is ultimately, I think, what really does need to happen for meaningful change to kind of stick. The other thing that I think we really need to see more of, and that would be crucial for this to happen, and I guess here we have the opportunity for a little bit more hope, given that we are seeing the introduction of Native people in the Biden administration. I'm thinking particularly here of Deb Haaland, right? I think for a long time, advocates of Native health, but Indigenous politics more broadly, have always been making the case that until there is representation of Native people within the spaces of government, it's going to be much harder for Native communities to kind of get the sort of traction that they need to really make the case in a way that's going to stick. And so I think, perhaps that's a way of trying to see a little bit of hope with this administration. I think Biden's made a point of trying to appoint a very, sort of diverse team across the board. So, we'll see. But I think, it is still early days. There have been moments of hope in the past. So I think, it's a big problem, but it would help if the government could follow the lead of Native communities on this issue, because they're really pushing for self-determination here, right? So it's not simply money, but it's also, let us decide how that money gets utilized, let us decide how that money gets dispersed. So big question, Brian. I don't really have a solid answer, but, I think it's an important thing to think through.
Your response, I think, takes care of another question, but I did want to bring it up in case you wanted to add to that. Rebecca Green asks, how will the 1.9 trillion recently passed in any way affect medical care for Native Americans in urban areas or in general? But I don't know if you wanted to add anything in response to that, or.
I don't think I really do. I mean, I think it's really yet to be seen, right? And I think the interesting thing to think about is, if we just sort of limit our thinking to kind of COVID, and thinking about how some of the CARES funding has been, utilized by Native communities, it really is striking. And, I keep making mention of this piece in the Times, but I think it's just, so timely, and it does sort of raise a really interesting example. There is a kind of a remarkable difference, shall we say, in the ways in which a lot of tribal governments and communities have been able to really kind of utilize public health funding in much more successful ways than I think we've seen elsewhere across the nation. And I think it raises a really interesting question about why. And I would point us to this kind of long tradition of centering health as a part of community welfare, as a part of the sort of politics around sovereignty. I think that all really matters. So yeah, I think if you haven't checked out that article, go to it. It really does raise some interesting questions. The other thing that comes up in there, which I think is a really important point, and maybe this links in a roundabout way to your question, Rebecca. I think as much as we can kind of speak in somewhat general terms about what's going on within Native health, the other point that's really always really important to underscore is that, tribal communities are positioned very, very, very differently, right? I mean, even at the level of federal recognition or not, right? And in terms of, their long histories and how central health has been to their particular politics within their particular communities. And that's why we see, in a case like Cherokee, a great deal of, success, but in sort of other communities that aren't as well resourced or don't have as much sort of, internal ability to produce revenue, it's not the case that there has been, this kind of massive success like we've seen in the case of Cherokee. So I think, as much as we can kind of, make some general claims about what might happen, it's also going to sort of play out really differently in communities, just sort of depending on how they're situated too, and what kind of resources they have within their own tribal governments as well.
Yeah, there's something I want to ask you as well, this to pivot a little bit. So you've been at UMass Boston for a few years now.
Mhm.
Um, what's your teaching like? This is, I imagine that courses like yours, I mean, and you and I have taught together here at Columbia. And I think for both of us, it's often, I think we've probably, well, I don't want to speak for you, but I imagine you found that a lot of times putting together, syllabi on these topics, you're really kind of inventing something new. There is no kind of, there aren't that many syllabi which you could borrow from colleagues in the field.
Mhm.
And and you and I also both work in fields that rapidly change, which is a great thing because no two syllabi look alike. What are you teaching these days?
Thanks, Sam. I love that question. I love to talk about teaching because I love teaching. And I love our students at UMass Boston too. They're really incredible. And there are several of them here, which I'm so happy to see.
You have a great medical center there too. I imagine you have some pre-med and medical students who take
Yeah,
your courses.
yeah. I mean, right before I went on leave, I was supposed to give a talk at the medical school actually, but that kind of got pushed back and then COVID and blah blah blah. But I hope it'll still happen at some point. We've also got an incredible nursing school, and so there's a lot of opportunities for kind of cross campus, organizing and sort of, I guess, students coming from lots of different parts of the university, with an interest in these issues. I think, for me, what's been really interesting about my time at UMass Boston so far is that because our department has such a kind of rich and robust public history program, that sort of in its sort of originating days was tied to Jim Green's work, and has since passed on to the capable hands of my colleagues Jane Becker and Nick Jurovich, another alum of our program.
Yeah.
I've had incredible opportunities to do a lot of sort of public facing, public history engaged teaching, and that's long been an interest of mine. Even in my time at Columbia with the work that we did with CMAP, the South El Monte Arts Posse, just a shout out to them. And so I've had an opportunity to develop a lot of new syllabi that sort of think about positioning Native history through a kind of public history lens and sort of problematizing the representation of a lot of Native history and culture and peoples within dominant society and culture and popular culture, which has been a really fun way to try and touch on some of these issues and some of these histories. And I think for me has been a real opportunity as well to sort of, kind of do a more sort of public facing kind of teaching that's allowed me as a sort of new resident of Boston to get to know the city a little bit better as well. Like we had this fantastic Mellon grant that funded one of my classes recently that allowed me to bring students on 7 field trips across the semester. And it was just really, really an exciting way to teach. So yeah, I've had great opportunities so far. I think, once we're back to face-to-face teaching, I'm really excited to think a little bit more about how I can maybe structure a class more around the sorts of issues that I think have come to the surface as a result of COVID, because I think all our minds are there, obviously. So yeah, I think, I'm looking forward to thinking through these issues with students in times to come.
We will look forward to, first of all, hopefully bringing you back for a book talk when Sovereign Bodies, Urban Indigenous Health Activism in the United States and Australia, 1950 to 2020, is published. We very much look forward to seeing and reading that. I personally look forward to teaching it, of course. Thank you so much, Maria John. But before we send you out and before I also give you a proper thank you, just a little bit of last minute housekeeping for our audience. Please, if you can follow Maria John on Twitter. I looked up your Twitter account. I hope you don't mind. MJHK11. Did I get that right? I'm trying to read what's
Yeah,
on my screen
you
here.
did. You did.
MJHK11 on Twitter. At one point, I thought I had written down the Urban Indian Health Institute. I think it's their Twitter account, but if you just Google Urban Indian Health Institute, you will find their website and their Twitter account for more information. You can follow us here at the Lehman Center at CU Lehman Center, LECULEHMAN Center, and our website, of which we are very proud, brand new site, lehmancenter.history.columbia.edu for future events coming up next week, in fact. So please do check that. Emma, have I missed anything else? I probably should have warned her that I was going to be calling on her. I think I might have.
I think you're good.
All right.
I put all of that information in the chat.
Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you again for everything. So as I said, were we in our newly refurbished digs at the Lehman Center, this is where you'd be sent off with a resounding applause. Maria, so good to see you again. This work is fantastic. So stay safe and stay well, and we're gonna look out for the new book.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's been such a pleasure. Really, really.
Likewise. See you soon in person once we